Hello and welcome to episode 163 of Page One, the Writers Podcast. I'm Tarek.
I'm Marco, and thanks for joining us for another episode of the podcast where we like to speak to writers of all kinds about their writing careers, find out how they got into the industry, and try and get as many hints and tips from them as possible. We've got a great back catalogue of previous guests there, so please do check that out. But we have a great guest this week and someone whose book I have just read. And it's a very good book, I should say, as well.
This week we're chatting with the awesome Nick Harkaway, who writes speculative thrillers, I suppose, kind of really, unique, imaginative stories he writes. And also, we should probably say, because he talks about his dad a bit on the podcast, he's the son of the late, great John le Carre, and that obviously had quite an impact on him.
Yeah, I mean, he talks about how... he kind of wanted to break in without that being the reason that he broke in a way.
Yes.
So
yes.
He talks about how he sort of tried to manoeuvre that.
He went into kind of the screenwriting side of things first. So he's written for a number of different formats and some really interesting insights into everything. Yeah,
no, definitely. It's a really interesting chat. He's a really fun guy to chat to, and he's got so many great ideas. And just talking to him about, if you've read his book Gnomon, you'll know that is an extremely ambitious and complex novel that works, which sometimes these novels are extremely ambitious and they don't work, but Gnomon does. And he talks about sort of the journey and the difficulties with writing that. And he also tells us about Titanium Noir, which is his latest book, which is the one that I have just read and enjoyed. But that's enough from us. We'll get straight into after a quick advert for our writer's notebook. But before we get into it, I just wanted to mention that if you're listening to this on the 2nd of June, you can come to Chimera Festival tomorrow, Saturday the 3rd of June, and watch us do a live recording of the podcast with the brilliant RJ Barker. That's at 3:30pm at the Pleasance in Edinburgh. It's a free event. You do need a ticket. You can get it at the link in the podcast description, and you can come along and ask RJ a question or just come and laugh at us.
With us, Marco.
Oh, sorry.
With us.
With us, yes, absolutely. But otherwise, we'll get straight into it, and we'll be back at the end of the podcast with a bit more chat and to let you know about next week's guest.
On with the podcast.
The blank page. To some, it's terrifying, an obstacle to overcome. But we prefer to think of it as an opportunity, a blank canvas to be filled with all of the adventures and characters in our head. So how to overcome that fear? Well, we all know the best advice for a writer is write. Seriously, get words on the page and more will follow.
But what about later, when you start trying to pull those threads of what you've written together? What about the character you wrote about way back at the start? Who was she again? What was she carrying? And where did she leave the MacGuffin that she now really needs in the third act? Think about all those top thrillers you like to read, or that amazing drama you just watched. What did they all have in common? Structure and planning.
As aspiring writers ourselves, we've tried many different methods to try and organise all the thoughts about the stories we want to tell. We've been there searching for a piece of scrap paper to note something down, or making a quick note on our phone in between meetings.
Or sometimes we'll make a note in whatever notebook we're carrying, or a document on our laptop so we don't forget that great idea. Let's be honest, it can all be a bit messy and it's easy to lose track of everything. And that's when we realised it's not just the story that needs structure and planning, but the way we gather all of our thoughts about it as well.
And so we made Page One. Page One is more than just another notebook. It's a place to put down all your ideas for your latest project, divided into easy-to-use sections that will help you plan your story, so that when that blank page comes calling, you're ready to answer. And then afterwards, once it's written, we realised you need to plan how to let people read it, so we included a section relating to submissions.
Each one is designed for one project, whether you want to write a book, screenplay, a comic, or any other kind of story. We truly believe that when you use it, it will help you get to the main event, writing your story. So we hope this helps.
We can't wait to read what you come up with.
And remember, every story starts with page one.
Did you always want to be a writer? Because I know obviously you grew up in a literary household, so I don't know if it was always an ambition.
No, I mean, so I always loved telling stories, but I didn't. No, I started when I was at university. I wanted to do either environmental politics or something around Eastern Europe. I left and I got a job in the film industry, really just to kind of be the first thing that I did because it was exciting and interesting, and because I'd sort of debated whether I was going to go on and do more academic study, and I actually couldn't face being in an educational environment for a longer period of time. I was like, I have to be in the world. So obviously, I went to the most down to earth, sensible environment. I went and worked in the film industry, which is completely nuts. And no, and then I wanted. After I'd done that for a few years, I started doing film scripts, and I was reasonably terrible at that. But I did that for quite a while, So I came to writing a novel in whatever it was, 2006, quite elliptically.
Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, you said there that you started out sort of in terms of writing screenplays and things like that. What was it that drew you to that? Was it because you were working in the film industry and you thought?
Yeah, it was right there in front of me, and critically also, it was something my dad didn't do, or at least didn't do very much of. And so I thought, well, that's great. Then I can, if I'm going to tell stories, I can tell them over here in this space, and that's just, everybody will be delighted, and there won't be this conversation. I mean, inevitably, of course, that was nonsense. Conversation follows you wherever you go. But that was my sort of self-delusion at the ripe old age of whatever it was, 20-something, 26, 27.
And so, what, how long did you try sticking it out at the screenwriting before you said, I'm gonna turn my hand to novels?
If you take the sort of whole time, rather than, for example, suggesting that I wasn't a proper writer until I was a bit better at it, it's 9 years.
Right.
And I existed in that sort of virtual industry space where you get commissioned, you make a bit of money, the commission falls through, you do the next thing, and so on. And that's, hilariously, the myth always with the UK film industry is that you don't get paid as much as you would in Hollywood, but you get to keep your soul. My experience was that your soul got trampled either way, but in the UK you just got paid a lot less for the pleasure of feeling sort of soiled in your basic self. No, I mean, and that's really unfair, right? I mean, the UK film industry makes amazing stuff. Film and TV industry makes amazing stuff. But it's not always easy for people to access, and the conversations are not as artistic and highfalutin as the industry's self-presentation would have you believe.
So what sort of stuff were you trying to pitch and trying to write when you were writing screenplays? Was it similar stuff to what your books were, or was it radically different?
You mean, was I going into producer's office and watching their heads explode? I mean, kind of. No, I mean, so when I wrote The Gone Away World, part of the point of that was that I was doing all the things you couldn't do in a film script. I mean, it was long, it was mad, it was sort of multi-generational, it was strange, it was visual effects heavy, if from a film context, and so on. And there was lots of backstory, really more backstory than front story. So it was absolutely infuriating as a film project. And indeed, there is a brave man who has the film rights, and I've not seen what the scripts look like. I'm fascinated by what they've done, but I haven't been part of it. No, what was I pitching? I pitched a story about escaping from a collapsed, slightly fascist United Kingdom by train through the tunnel to France, and rebuilding the train was basically a sort of a work of love. It was an act of humanity, and putting the train back together was a community of people, and they made music together, and they ate together, and there was a chef involved. It was all about food and sensation and so on. And I still think that's a good project, actually. Post Brexit, even more. I was going to say, and then I had another one which was about using social mathematics, the 6 degrees of separation, to solve a murder. And the conceit is that you ask the question, do you know anything about this crime? And you ask, and you get people to ask their friends, and sooner or later someone does know something. By definition, if you can get the message to propagate. What that also means, though, is that whoever actually committed the murder sees you coming before you know about them. It's like a radar pulse, except you have no defenses. So there was, so that was quite interesting. And that's actually, in retrospect, probably the most ridiculous thing to try to do on film. It's such a difficult thing to portray visually.
That's right.
It's a really interesting idea that I think I would balk at now, and I had absolutely no idea how to do then. I tried really hard, and people were interested, but also kind of rightly wary and said, this is impossible.
It does feel like British TV in particular is kind of starting to take more risks maybe than it did maybe 20 years ago. I'm thinking of things like Devs, which I can't really imagine an older BBC gotten involved with. It seems to be putting more feelers into kind of like speculative genre work, maybe than it as opposed to just like another period drama, which is I always kind of think of when I think of British TV.
Yeah, I think that's. I think so. I think there is a slowly an ever greater acceptance of speculative fiction in the UK. It's really interesting. I am not academically able in this particular discussion. I'm not properly versed in the literature and in what people have said about it and so on. But the impression I have is that here, the dislike of speculative fiction comes from from the very beginning, really. When C.P. Snow and F.R. Leavis squared off over H.G. Wells, and it just doesn't really get better. And the science fiction and fantasy worlds become a refuge for people who are broadly disapproved of by mainstream society, which makes it worse, in terms of the acceptance of the stories. Meanwhile, in the States, you have this moment with Philip K. Dick and so on, where the counterculture and the mainstream and the literatures kind of collide in some way. And there's an intersection there of ideas and culture, which somehow produces something slightly different, a slightly different attitude. So they seem to be, to my eye, they seem to be slightly ahead of us in that conversation. And certainly the conversations in general that people are having around the stuff that I've written, the American perspective tends to be less bothered about what shelf does this book go on, and more interested in, what's the underlying political idea? What are you saying? Are we comfortable with what you're saying? Are we uncomfortable? But whatever it is, there's a much greater sense that the first stop is to engage with the concept rather than to ask, how is this classified? And I have no idea whether that is a universal experience or whether that's just me.
I think it is true. There definitely does seem to be a wider acceptance of sort of genre more generally in the mainstream in the UK and the US nowadays. I don't know if it's just because people that were into that sort of stuff are now sort of growing up, and so there is more...
Well, they run the world.
Well, exactly. That's
look at thing. Marvel. The biggest films now are superhero movies. That's just,
exactly. I suppose it could be something.
I think also, the thing is that actually in the 90s you could still say, I'm going to write a book about the human condition and I'm not going to include technology because that's not part of the discussion. It's a distraction. You could still say, I'm not giving my characters mobile phones because that's just unnecessary. But now if you do that in 2023, if you say, we're not going to mention computers, we're not going to mention mobile phones, you're writing historical fiction. Nothing wrong with historical fiction, but that's what you're doing. You cannot any longer lay claim, I don't think, to the idea that you can write a human story and ignore the contemporary technology, because what it comes down to is whenever you write, is in its by its own terms modern. Nobody thinks of themselves as living in the past. There's probably a book to be written about, I don't know, sort of medieval siege catapult engineers kind of thinking they're living at the forefront of technology. But genuinely, everybody believes they live in the future, not the past.
Absolutely. So with the Gone Away World, your first book, you wrote that. What was the road to getting that one published? How did you find an agent and that sort of thing?
I did. I was convoluted. Not convoluted. It was actually very straightforward. But I did sort of exactly what you would imagine. I didn't want to be. The first thing was that I knew London publishing. Like half of the people that I would submit to had, on one level or another, sat me on their knee when I was growing up, and I didn't want to have that affect what happened with the book. And I knew it was going to, but I wanted to delay that for as long as possible. So I spoke to Roland Phillips, and I said, Roland, how do I do this? I don't want to be traveling that road, but at the same time, I can't avoid it. And Roland said, well, you need to talk to Patrick Walsh. And you sent in the book and just get on with it. And Roland called Patrick and said, someone's going to send you something, and I'm not telling you anything about them. And so Patrick read the book without knowing who this lunatic was, and said, okay, this is mad. And he loves wild, strange, beautiful things. Patrick is one of the most interesting people to talk to. And watching as his client, sort of watching him go out into the world to source projects, to find somebody to write about kind of looking after elephants and, these extraordinary things that he wants to find the interesting, the strange, and the human, and apparently the elephant. And so he said, I'll take this on. And, from then on, it was just a question of letting Patrick do what he does best. I mean, that was it. And it's a completely unrealistic path into publication, but it was the best I could do,
But I mean, you say that, but it was also the fact it was read blind. That must take a lot of the kind of pressure or the expectation or whatever off that, and you have kind of gone in as much as any other person would, I suppose, at that point.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, because yes, but no. So yes, he's reading blind, but at the same time, Roland was a sort of senior publisher. He wasn't nobody. So there's a solid flag to say pay attention. But I mean, agents read unsolicited manuscripts. That's part of the gig, and you see it all the time. People fish something out of the slush pile and say, "Wow, this is special." It just takes a really long time because there's thousands of novels and only a limited number of people reading at any given moment.
Yeah. And how did you find the actual process of writing that novel compared to, obviously you'd been writing screenplays and things like that? Was it an easier or more difficult
Books are a lot longer.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I found that actually wonderful was the first thing, because I felt really trapped by the sort of hard limits on screenplays. Now, of course, in retrospect, I realized that you just ignore the hard limits on screenplays. That's not, you ignore the limits and everyone goes, you are limit breaking, you're a genius.
Yeah.
And then of course they said, the other thing that the film industry does is they go, this is magnificent, this is the most exciting property we've ever seen, could you do us something like this but slightly less original and in 90 pages?
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, and I mean, I'm being really unfair, right? Because I'm involved with UK film and TV at the moment, and I'm dealing with the most magnificent people. But my experience in the 90s was essentially people turning around saying, we really love your sample script. It's too crazy. Go away and write something that's completely recognizable and we can talk, and could you in the meantime do a couple of episodes of Doctors, so that we can. And can you imagine what would happen if I wrote a couple of episodes of Doctors? I mean,
I think they would be the most tuned into episodes.
The notorious, I don't know, London earthquake episodes. I knew Dave Humphreys, who wrote London's Burning for years, and Dave said it was driving him crazy because he couldn't think of anything else to set fire to.
I mean, the Gone Away World came out, and Angel Maker, your second novel, came out, and Angel Maker, they're both very well received. Angel Maker won awards. It was nominated for the Arthur C. Clarke Award. I mean, I suppose at that point, did you start to feel validation or stuff something you'd done on your own 2 feet, or that kind of, as much as you can take away the expectation or your background, etc., but just the work itself?
I mean, so I felt good. I mean, once you've written a book and people have read it and liked it, you don't feel, you don't feel the same horror. You feel a new horror when you write a book.
Yeah.
It's kind of the second book is the hardest, the third book is the hardest, the fourth book is the hardest. It's always the next one. It's always the next one that's interesting, and it's always the next one that's the hardest. Although then you write something like Gnomon, and actually that's always going to be the hardest. That was I don't know what I was thinking. We'll get to that. No, I mean, so yeah, I wrote Gone Away World, and that was like a kind of massive explosion. I was breaking loose of everything, and I literally put hundreds of elephants in it. I've worked on a film with actual elephants in it. Actually, Angel Maker's got elephants in it. That's right. No, but I worked on a film with an elephant. And the weird thing about elephants is that they're not easy to put on film, because if you get really close to them, they're just like a big grey wall. Mm-hmm. And if you get further away, they look unsatisfyingly small. So elephants are like, I think there's a deep secret about film production in the existence of elephants. The director always wants an elephant. And the producer knows that the elephant is just useless. It's nothing. You can't do anything with an elephant. And then like the actor is worried because they know that if you put an elephant on the screen, it's got those deep eyes. And it's like, this elephant is going to take focus off me. And so they don't really necessarily want the elephant. And then the elephant wrangler knows that the elephant is shy. So it doesn't want to be on stage with the actor. And it gets worse and worse. And there's like every aspect of film, you can work out how it works by their reaction to the elephant.
There you go. The secret to filmmaking.
Secret to film is that how do you respond to the elephant?
Yeah, I like it. And you referred to Gnomon there, which is like, I think it's fair to say a hugely ambitious and complex novel. And all your novels delve into these sort of speculative worlds, have lots of ideas and things like that. But Gnomon, as you pointed out, is one that stands head and shoulders above those. I mean, what were you thinking, first of all, when you decided to try and write this?
So okay, I'll tell you what I was thinking. I'd written Tigerman, which was the most linear thing I'd ever written. It was sort of tight and thrillerish, and it takes place within, I think it's 12 days or something, the whole sequence. Mm-hmm. And I'd really enjoyed that, and I'd had a great time with it. And I was excited, and I'd been reading a lot of magical realist stuff. And I thought, I know. And I think, I had quite young children. And I think I'd spent quite a lot, because my daughter was born in 2010, my son was born in 2013. I'd spent quite a lot of the time since 2010 sleep deprived and mildly insane. Mm-hmm. And I think that had kind of collected in my head into, along with all the kind of weird stuff I was reading. And I was like, hey, I can do this. This will be great. And at the same time, I'd been submerged because my wife was working for an organization called Reprieve, and they specialized in litigating around the war on terror, getting people who shouldn't be in Guantanamo out of Guantanamo, and indeed nobody should be in Guantanamo, so it was a broad target. And so I was immersed in that, which obviously comes through very strongly in Tigerman, and I was getting twitchy about the threads of authoritarianism that I saw in the global political discussion, but specifically in the UK. And I thought I should write a short, pithy, magical realist assault on the idea of authoritarianism and surveillance and so on. And I honestly believed when I started writing Gnomon that it would be shorter than Tigerman. I thought I could do it like kind of almost just beyond the length of a novella. And that's not what happened. Oh, and it's all William Gibson's fault, because he said that he just dived into things. He had the idea and he didn't plan. He just went in and went where the story took him. I thought, okay, well, if Gibson does it, I've got to try that and do it like that. So 200,000 words later, turns out that I'm not necessarily disciplined in my thought in the same way, and perhaps conceivably I should plot novels more carefully. No, I mean, it was an amazing ride. It was absolutely extraordinary, and it nearly broke me. It was a huge experience of writing. I learned more from Gnomon than I've learned from, well, that's not quite true. I was going to say from anything else, but I learned a huge amount from it. And I all kinds of things that I'd sort of previously believed in as absolute truth just had to go to the wall. The most obvious one of which was I believed that you should write from the beginning of a book to the end, and that when you wrote a given scene for the first time, there was a special magic, that came from that, and you shouldn't waste it by prejudging how the scene was going to come, before you got to it. You needed to come to it the way the characters did.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's precious. I'm just kind of like, oh, that is nasty. I mean, no, if you can do it that way consistently, and if you produce the results, if you're happy that way, that's great. But first of all, the magic is there the first time you write it, whether it's in sequence or not. And second, one of the things that I realized after writing a really convoluted book is that you need the way stations. Those scenes that you think are sacred are the scenes that you write, and they tell you, you write them and lock them as far as you can. And they tell you what the rest of the book has to do. Whenever someone has a conversation about the difficult middle chapters, great, write the end, then write the beginning. And now you know the two ends. You know what the middle's got to do. So draw the line between them. I mean, it's not that simple, but the number of things that I put in my own way that slowed me down when I was writing that book. And that's the first one that comes into my head every time is, no, just write the scene that you want and then engineer the rest of it to get there. That's,
But does writing, I mean, I can see what you're saying there in terms of how that might help, but does writing that way sometimes give your future self problems if you're you've got scenes that you've written ahead and then you're like, oh wait, how can this work? Try to get everything to fit together and all of that sort of thing.
Then you might have to change them, and that's not terrible either. They get better when you rewrite them, not worse.
Yeah.
So, but I had all this stuff that I was carrying around that I thought was the proper way of doing it. And, and I suspect that I subconsciously believed was how Dad did it. Well, although actually I never really knew I knew what some of his process looked like, but obviously, I don't know what went on in his office. And I just sort of made it up. I was like, oh, I know how to do this. And actually, obviously, when you start, you don't know how to do it. You know something, you know enough. And what I knew from screenwriting was that I could finish a story, and that's really useful. If you know that, that's great. And then if if you've written anything that's long, if you've written a thesis or a, long form nonfiction, anything like that, you know that you can do it. That's hugely helpful. That's the biggest advantage there is. And if you know that if you just do the mathematics. If you write 2,000 words a day for 30 days, 90 days, you'll get there. It's not, one of the great things about NaNoWriMo is that it's, in a sense, a mathematical operation. If you write a given number of words a day, you will get to 55, 65, 75,000 words, and that's a book. Now, it might be a terrible book, but that's fine. That's what editing's for, So, but Gnomon, lots of things had to happen. And yes, I made problems for myself and then I fixed them. What I discovered about that was that I had these interlocking narratives, each of which depended on the other. So every time I tried to write it from beginning to end, it was like trying to solve an equation with none of the variables.
Yeah.
And so it kept on locking and falling apart. And I did that thing that people do in films where you get like red string and you get close text and and I tried to do the timelines in the book, and I was like, okay, well, this is great because where they overlap, they will cross, and I can put the text of the crossover there, and then I'll know, and then I can move, and I can see, like, I can have a visual, physical representation of the complexity of this novel. So basically, I generated like a serial killer nest in my office with photographs and notes and so on. And the first thing I have to say is that it in no way enlightened me as to what was going on in the book. The visual representation, not helpful. The second thing that happened was that the string got so heavy that it pulled the blue tack off the wall and the entire structure fell onto the floor where it was obviously in a mess, which is basically was also illustrative.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I have come to the conclusion. I have two takeaways from this. First thing is that serial killers do not make those nests. They become serial killers because they try to write a novel, and that was what happened to them. And the second thing, which is arguably more important, I have, of course, forgotten. Hang on. Oh, yeah. Until that moment, until writing Gnomon, I had also believed that you had to hold the entirety of a book in your head at any given time in order to write it. You had to have the whole thing, and then all of that would play into any given scene you were writing. So you'd write the scene in fullest knowledge of the plot. sort of godlike. And with Gnomon, that was not possible. I could not contain it all at the time. I could have a sort of vague instinctive sense at any moment, but I had to deal with scenes as if they were complete and trust that the overarching plotting that I'd done earlier and what I'd set myself, what this scene has to do, was accurate. So it was a much more of a mosaic process than I normally do. And it was that was fascinating and kind of terrifying. And I think it works. I think all of it hangs together. There are a couple of places where I feel the scenes are slightly rough, and I should have caught that, but the edit was so enormous that we didn't. But I think all the moving parts work, which is kind of extraordinary. And it really was more like designing an engine, or more like how I imagined designing an engine would be than writing a book, or writing the books that I had written.
Did you send William Gibson a thank you note for telling you to start in that way then?
I have blamed him repeatedly on social media and elsewhere. He is, as it turns out, a very nice man, and therefore he laughs at me and sort of generally approves. So no, he's lovely, and it's one of the kind of weird kind of things that in my life that here is this guy who my sort of 16-year-old self essentially regarded as sort of the greatest creator of anything, and now we have cake.
And so has your writing process, has it remained, obviously it kind of hit this Gnomon point and it changed, and then have you kept it up? Is that still your process now, or
no? It's completely different now. So having written Gnomon, I didn't want to do it that way anymore because it was maddening, and I sprained my pineal gland. So the next thing that happened was that as I was completing Gnomon, I'd submitted the book to my publisher, and the Brexit vote happened, and I was in a reasonably fraught state anyway, for various reasons, partly because I just finished Gnomon, I went absolutely nuts. I was so angry. And I was particularly angry because the form that my anger took was to be very creative. And that was one of the things that Nigel Farage said would happen. He said that we would be spurred to great creativity by Brexit. And that made me even angrier because it was clearly such nonsense. And yet I was doing it. And I was and so I wrote, in the space of a very short time, the first Aiden Truhen novel, The Price You Pay. It's absolutely the most violent, bizarre, twisted book I've ever written, except possibly the second Aiden Truhen novel. And I wrote it in a very linear way. And that's a book. I mean, this is the other thing that I learned, is that the way that you write a book can really hinge on what kind of book it is. So I wrote Gnomon and learned all kinds of tricksy, convoluted styles and not keeping the book all in your head at the time and whatever. And then I came out of it and I found myself writing The Price You Pay, which is a book you can hold in your head and is a book you can write in a completely linear way. And indeed, it basically, one thing happens at the beginning, which builds up all this kind of narrative potential energy, and then you flick the rock off the top of the mountain and just everything cascades down to the bottom, and that's it. It's a very simple storyline, very much in the line of something like I, the Jury, which indeed I was reading over and over again in between writing The Price You Pay. But that's because, here is a guy who is essentially a bit bonkers, but broadly speaking, a non-violent white-collar criminal cocaine dealer in the US, who finds out that the 7 most awful people in the world have been hired to kill him. And his immediate reaction, because his fundamental identity is that he is somebody who immediately recognizes the rules of engagement. His immediate reaction is, wow, this is fantastic. Now I can do all the horrible arch villain stuff that I've always dreamed about doing, but couldn't do because that would be totally unreasonable. And so because now he's in a battle for survival with the 7 most terrible people on Earth, so he can do awful things because the alternative is just that they wipe him out. So there are no longer any limits. And indeed, he basically acknowledges none and does terrible things to them. And it's quite interesting. In the second Jack Price book, one of the questions is, because people ask me, is he a psychopath? Like, no, he's not a psychopath. What he does is the thing that we can't do, most of us, is that he recognizes exactly, perfectly, what rules the rest of the world is playing by. And then he acknowledges those rules. I'm terrible at that. I never understand what rules other people are playing by. And I think, very often we misunderstand in sort of social and broader political context what the other side or the other sides are doing.
Yeah.
And we get stitched up like a kipper. And he's not that person. The thing about Jack is that if you're scrupulously polite and law-abiding, you can interact with him endlessly, and he will be exactly the same. If you try to kill him, he will try to kill you back. And he has absolutely no intervening, there's no adjustment time at all. He's like, oh, are we doing this now?
Yeah.
So that's not psychopathy. That's something completely different and arguably more terrifying.
And with those books, was it always the intention that you wanted to write them under a different name because they were a sort of
that sort of happened because they're so mad. And my UK publisher, they just looked at them and they're like, what is this? This is crazy. And and you've written it now. So now we've got 2 books by you, and it just didn't work for them. And so in order to bring them out here at this, sort of in a timely fashion, or at all actually, I went to Serpent's Tail. And we agreed that I'd publish under a different name. And Aiden Truhen is an anagram of Diana Hunter. Diana Hunter being the pulp novelist, literary novelist, character, antagonist, protagonist, whatever, in Gnomon.
Yeah.
And so there's a kind of slightly tenuous literary gag there, because the idea is that you can go online, unscramble the anagram, and discover that there are indeed books by this person. And because Gnomon is a kind of shifting realities joke, that's and I almost published them as Diana Hunter. But
the Harkaway multiverse.
The Harkaway multiverse, exactly. And so the book in Gnomon, one of her books is called Mr. Murder Investigates. And we nearly called The Price You Pay Mr. Murder Investigates, but it's not a very good title for the price you pay, so we didn't.
Well, your latest novel is Titanium Noir, which is just out.
Yes.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about what the book's about?
So that's my first new Nick Harkaway novel since Gnomon came out, because I've had stuff in between, and it is a noir story with a science fiction twist, or a science fiction detective story, depending on how you want to look at it. And it is about a detective in a noirish city who is called in to solve the murder of a Titan. And Titans are, normally speaking, the very, very rich who have taken a drug called T7, which makes you young again, but also makes you 20% bigger, physically bigger. So each time you take it, you get cumulatively larger, and that means that by the time you've taken it 3 or 4 times, you're 14 foot tall or something. And there's a well, no, we'll get to that. But this guy, this particular Titan, doesn't seem to be that person at all. He seems to be, he's living in an ordinary flat. So there's something going on, and it's obviously, it's huge fun. I had a great time writing this, sort of working in that Philip Marlowe, I, the Jury, kind of all these, sort of in that space, and sort of, yes, absolutely, kind of enjoying the Blade Runners and the Neuromancers and those kind of crossover spaces that have gone before, but also kind of doing my own thing, and it's huge fun. And so obviously, inevitably, this perfectly simple, ordinary murder takes you into the dark history of the world and the shadows of the noir universe. So it's fun, and I'm hoping there'll be more.
Well, I was going to ask about that because I'm reading it now. I'm really enjoying it, and it did strike me as a book that would be fun to write, just to write in that voice, the voice of Cal, and so you do have plans then to hopefully revisit that world then.
I do indeed. Yeah. Well, I mean, so far everybody seems to think that's a good idea. It's the moment when someone comes along and goes, "This is a terrible book," and they're like, "No, okay, well, I'm not writing anymore." But because that's obviously the moment. It doesn't matter how many people tell you they love the book. When someone tells you it's terrible, that's when you love it. It's the only comment that ever matters again, right? This is why I genuinely don't read reviews anymore, because if you believe the good ones, then somebody will show you a bad one and you'll believe that, and it doesn't matter how many good ones there were because you only believe the bad one.
Yeah.
And it's taken me whatever it is since 2007, is it 2007, 2008, to get to that point where I genuinely do not have to read them. I can get the little Google alert and to go, "Oh, somebody else has reviewed the book, marvelous," and not click the link.
Oh, that is self-control.
And genuinely, the most dangerous people in this regard are your friends, because they'll ring you up and go, "Oh, there's a great review. Just let me read you a little bit of it." And you're like, "No, don't do that." And people will also ring you up and go, "Oh, I was so angry. I saw that review in and it was awful, and they were so unkind about you. And you've got stupid eyebrows." And you're just kind of like, "Don't tell me that. My self-esteem is plummeting with every second we spend on this call."
I mean, all of your books, I think, are, you're speculative, but they address current issues. Gnomon's got surveillance. Tigerman and Noir's got this kind of separation between elites and the rest of the population and society. And I wondered, is that something which is important to you? Exploring these ideas in fiction, and is there a kind of catharsis in letting these characters have these arguments that you have with people, or you think in your head, etc.?
The only books that I've ever written the only book that I've ever written that was cathartic was The Price You Pay. Even Seven Demons, the sequel to that, wasn't catharsis. That was just, Seven Demons just kind of twisted love note to Switzerland. It's one of those things where you send someone a bouquet of flowers and realize that they're never going to talk to you again. I'm absolutely terrified that somebody in the Swiss government will read that book and just put me on a list. Be just like, "No, there is something wrong with you and you're not coming into the country." And frankly, they could not possibly be blamed for that. It is the most, it's one of those things where you write an Addams Family kind of value inversion gag and realize that, not everyone's going to realize there's value inversion going on. No, it's not even that it's important to me to look at issues. It's that I can't not. It's that thing. If your book's really about what your book's about, then you're in real trouble. If what it's about on the surface is the only thing it's about, then in the end, nobody's going to read it. Even if you write a book and it's ostensibly about espionage, but what it's actually about is friendship, that's fine. But if you write something and it's just about what it seems to be about, in the end, I think people will drift away. But again, it's not conscious for me. It's just those are the things that are worth writing about. I started writing Tigerman Noir and I was like, I want to do something, noirish, atmospheric, enjoyable, kinetic. I want it to have kind of rich, sort of, shady colors, and I want people to be drawn into this kind of slightly, I want to say, not really gothic, but there's a physical viscerality to that, to that style of writing, which I really wanted.
Yeah.
As opposed to an emotional viscerality. Honestly, what am I doing? Anyway, but without even choosing it, very, very quickly. In fairness, those original noir stories, they're about power and violence and betrayal and money and greed and appetite. And as soon as you start talking about power, violence, money, and appetite, you're telling a story like this, one way or another. The metaphor may sneak up on you. It didn't, I'm not aware, I can't remember at what point I began to realize that there might be a metaphorical component to having the very, very rich get physically enormous and all the good things in the world roll downhill into their grip, and everyone else is like on the kind of dry, arid peak of sort of, normal life. That kind of, I want to say that came as a surprise to me. It didn't, but I'm not sure that I ever made a conscious decision to do that. just that emerged from the process of coming up with this idea. The whole thing hangs together, and I think from my perspective, it's a single piece. As I look at it, there must have been a moment where I was just doing this.
Yeah.
But very early on, it became something about, but because I, first of all, just, thinking of the classic noirs, they, Marlowe goes, or, not Marlowe particularly, because that's more hard-boiled crime, but, these characters interact with the very powerful, and the powerful who can squash them like a bug, and yet, over whom they hold sway by dint of knowledge and so on. There's a constant tension. And, whenever a detective or an investigator of any kind is investigating something in that shadowy universe, the risk is that they'll find out something for which they need to be crushed.
Yeah.
And there's always the kind of moment, of will you take the payoff or will you get murdered? And, in Noir, very often they take the payoff and just walk away. It's because obviously it's kind of everything is very potentially very bleak and motivations don't. And I had this dialogue with myself, like, does this really count as noir? Because actually, Hal Sounder has quite a good heart. And conventionally, noir characters, are bitterer than that, more conflicted than that. But watch and see where it goes.
And so, I mean, when you're starting out on a new project, what comes first to you? What is it? Is it like, was it, I want to write a noir type novel? Was that the first thought, or did you have the idea of Cal, or was it this metaphor? What came first, or did they all sort of floating in there and suddenly it all comes together one day and then you start writing?
Sometimes I can answer that question. With Angel Maker, I can tell you that I was in a cafe and I saw a broken clockwork toy on the table, and there was a child playing with it at the next table. And when they left the clockwork toy behind. And I said, do you want this? Because it was just like, one of those things with a wind up clockwork motor, and it's basically made of paper clips. And, they're not quite out of a cracker, but they're £3 off a barrow.
Yeah.
Child said, no, kind of, it's broken. I don't want it. And Mum was like, fine. And for me, it was like holding the Holy Grail. I was holding this thing in my hands, and Angel Maker just happened in my head. It was about clockwork and things, the clockwork devices that make the world a better place. And then that collided with my kind of sort of the notion that I'd had in my head anyway of some kind of story involving a terrifying old woman who was basically Miss Marple with a handgun, and then with a kind of desire to do a London gangster story. And that was it. We were away, right? With Titanium Noir, I don't know. I think it feels to me like it just came out of nowhere. I wanted to do a story, and the disparate parts of it just meshed, and I was writing it. And I think almost, it's going to sound kind of weirdly counterintuitive, but actually for me, a lot of the time, it's not a textual thing at all. The germ of a novel is a feeling, a mood, and then as you write into that space, you realize that you've already got ideas, concepts, characters emerge from those, or concepts emerge from the characters. That's all very bound together. But the first thing isn't even a word; it's a inexpressible mood music. And your actual job is to take. Have you seen the Randall Munro cartoon about waking up in the morning and trying to describe your dreams?
I don't think I have, no.
Oh, it's unbelievably good. I mean, it's that moment which we've all had, where you get out of bed, and in the kind of thought bubble, there's airships and biplanes fighting one another, and cities of crystal and glass, and dinosaurs and pterodactyls, and kind of trimaran pirate ships on the ocean. Yeah. Everything's going on, and he goes running downstairs to tell everybody. And by the time he gets down the stairs, the thought bubble's just slowly erased until it's completely empty. And he's just like, I've got nothing. And the caption is every damn morning. And it's just the most perfect statement of that moment. And so for me, I think I get a sense of something that should contain all of those things in Randall Munroe's thought bubble, whatever they are, these mystical, amazing things. And the job then is to take that sense and hold on to it through the process of turning it into text.
Yeah.
And I always find it frustrating when people talk about having difficulty kind of realizing ideas and so on, as if there's a pure form, because there isn't. That the books happen, stories happen, film scripts happen in the process of text encountering ideas. There's nothing behind the curtain. You can't pull the veil aside and it's all there written for you. It's in the encounter between that moment of mood, that idea, and the process of turning it into text that books are generated. So you can't get it wrong. You can only not match the mood the way you want to or something. But anyway, so for me, it's that there's a kind of moment where I know what it's all about and I have to hold on to that. And actually, sometimes I'll take a single paragraph that I write that's the first thing that I ever write, but it's somehow expressive, and tape it up above the computer so I can look up at it and go, that and nothing else. If in doubt, does it work with that? No, then it's gone. Yeah. Does it pursue that? Yes, fine, it's in.
You can when you have these ideas, or when they germinate in your head, you're just like, this is it, this is brilliant.
Nebulous,
but as you say, it's like that cartoon. To then suddenly try and describe it or write it or something, it becomes, you realize it's a much bigger task than you think it's going to be. But if you can hold on to it, then that's when you can get something.
And I suppose you're right in the sense that the only person who knows the difference is you. No one else knows what the ultimate target was in your head. All they see is the finished product. So it's not like they read it and think, it was good, but it wasn't as good as the idea you had in your head.
That's right. Well, but also, like, the idea you have in your head is just that. It's non-verbal. It's just an idea. It's only a concept. It's only a this. It's only a that. The business is about teasing it out and making it into something. And you mustn't. I think it's really interesting, actually. I think maybe one of the most important things about writing, here we go, I've never said this out loud before, it may be nonsense. I think maybe one of the most important things is acknowledging to yourself that the idea isn't a book. The idea isn't the thing that you're going to end up with. The idea is just the compass needle, and you have to walk the road. There we go. God blimey.
No, I like that. That's good.
I like it. No, absolutely. I'm going to use that tomorrow. Seriously, I think it's very easy to tie yourself in knots when you're writing, because you feel like you kind of, you're getting it wrong. And you can be, but only in the sense that you're not telling the story that you want to tell. And then you have to make a decision, like, is the story that I want to tell the right story, or is the reason that I'm telling this story instead because this is the real story, this is the better one, and the idea wasn't great, but now I'm doing something? Or have I gone off track because I've let it collide with another idea that I actually want, and that should be over here, and then just separate them, and go back to where I was? And the thing that I find is that there is usually quite early on a paragraph that tells you everything you need to know about the book, that contains enough of that thought bubble that you can test it against what you're writing, and if it doesn't match and you're not happy with the mismatch, you bin what you've got and start again. And one of the great things about writing quickly, that's the other thing. I used to write quite slowly, and now I try to write as quickly as I can, because if you write quickly and it goes wrong, you go, oh, okay, I'm back to the beginning of the month, that's it. And you go back and you just junk it. And that's fine. It doesn't cost you really anything. It's 10 days, whatever. If you write really slowly and you're taking pains over the text and having a wonderful time with it, and then you realize you've made a wrong turn 3 months ago, 6 months ago, that's a disaster. So I really like writing at speed and jumping ahead and then coming back, because then you can always kind of go, this was right, but the execution is rubbish, and that's fine. I'll work with that. Or you go, I've gone astray, but it's only going to cost me a couple of days. Let's go back to here.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And what does that mean in terms of like drafts? So if you're writing quickly, presumably you get a first draft done fairly quickly. What are you? Is it, how clean is it? Do you revise as you go, or do you just get into the end of that first draft and then?
No, so the discipline is not to revise too much as you go. I find that really hard. I can very easily get stuck revising a single scene over and over again if I let myself, and so I don't. So I mean, I wrote the first draft of The Price You Pay in 27 days, I think. And and no, it wasn't clean. There was a next draft which was longer and had a different ending, and everything was tied together much better, and so on. Very difficult to say how long Titanium Noir took, because I wrote a bunch of it in November 2020, and then pretty much everything in my life became complicated. I mean, it was 2020, so pretty much everyone in everything's life became pretty complicated, but mine was no exception. So then I did this extraordinary thing where I edited's the wrong word. I did the final pass on my dad's last novel, Silverview, for publication. And he had a delivery draft, but not a publication draft. And there's, quite a big difference between the two. But we had to do it, very gently, so there couldn't actually be. When he was writing, he was notorious for kind of, the book would be virtually going to press and he'd be like, I'm just changing this scene. And his publisher would be going nuts. And obviously we couldn't, we didn't want to do that, couldn't do that, didn't want to change the book very much. But at the same time, you had to go through it and find the places where the sentences didn't get joined together, which were, hands up, very rare. But, so that was an odd, beautiful thing to do. But it took a piece out of my writing time. And then I had to sort of finish it off after doing that and come back to it and rewrite and so on. So, all told, I think it probably took 6 months to get the first draft. But that was an elongated process. Yeah. So, but it's there it is.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I have to ask you, you talked before, I think, about wanting to write a Star Wars film. Is that something you still quite like to do?
Yes. Dave Filoni, are you listening? Yeah, 100%. And I've always known what it was. It's a film or a TV show. I know exactly. I have two, but there's one that I like much more than the other, which I think is, which is more interesting. But and also it's relevant now. Whereas the first idea that I had when I was however young was relevant to making sequels after Return of the Jedi. No longer makes sense. Well, I mean, it still makes sense, but it's no longer as whatever. And then a couple of years later, I was like, oh, what about this? And that second one is an absolute zinger. And I desperately, I don't really care if I write it, actually. I want somebody to write it, and I would do it. And it'd be huge fun. So yeah, no, I definitely want to do it. But I want to play in all those extraordinary vineyards or whatever. What would you, gardens, jungles? I don't know what you call them. Anyway,
sandboxes. Yeah,
sandboxes. Thank you, God. Yeah, not vineyards. Anyway, you can see where my mind's at. It's 5:30. I'm like, oh, hello. Yeah, no. Playing those sandboxes, exactly. Because they're extraordinary. The thing about those shared universes is that they've acquired depth over an extraordinary amount of time.
Yeah,
and the consequence of that is that you can do really extraordinary things with them. I saw I can't remember what they're called, Jedi Tales, I think, little short pieces of animation, 6 of them, with some of them are about Count Dooku, some of them are about, I want to say, Ahsoka.
Yeah, I think there was one about Ahsoka. Yeah.
And they're yes, yeah, oh my God, and the last one is an absolute gut punch. They're unbelievable, and they're interlinked stories, but you don't realize how seriously you're being set up. But my God, I was like, oh, that hurts. That is a piece of storytelling. And you can do that because it's like, I get very irate when people say that The Godfather 2 is better than Godfather 1. It's like, yeah, it's a fantastic movie. It does have quite a long prologue.
Yes.
Where you set up the world and you meet all these extraordinary characters and you care about them in the first place. You can watch it without, but that doesn't mean it was written sui generis. It's what it is. And I actually, for what it's worth, I also prefer the first Godfather movie, and I prefer the first Star Wars movie. Not because Empire's not brilliant; it's clearly the best one. But I still, but again, it's the best one because it's got an hour and a half prologue.
Yeah.
Um, and incidentally, I love the new ones. I'm absolutely sold on them. Not so much the first new ones, but the new ones.
Yeah, the Andor TV series in particular was amazing.
Andor's great.
Fantastic.
Yeah, it's really good. Well, and I mean, I inevitably see connections with the Le Carre universe, which perhaps is a family trait that I would see those. But I do, and I think that's first of all, I think Andor is a thing unto itself. It doesn't. It's not that it's derivative of that, but I just think it has that in its makeup. And I think that does both of them favors. I think it's great, But no, I was watching Andor, and there's a moment when they go underwater. They're kind of scubaing into the thing, and completely without reason, really, just because it's amazing. They show us the underwater thing, and you think, you're familiar with all those kind of moments where something underwater eats someone in the Star Wars franchise, and you think that might happen, and then it doesn't. They're just showing it to you because it's gorgeous and because it's part of the story, and you're just, oh yeah, this is its own thing. But somehow for me, that was the moment when I was like, oh no, they're not messing around here. This is a thing unto itself. I'm worried about season 2. I heard a rumor that not a rumor, I think it's known to be true, that it takes us into the last 3 days before Rogue One. And
I read that as well,
I'm a bit twitchy about that. But you have to trust people, because that first season was really, really good.
Yeah, absolutely. So Titanium Noir is just out. You possibly, hopefully revisit that world. I mean, what have you got in the pipeline? You said you were working with TV as well. You may not be able to tell us any of this.
Things I can't talk about. One on a list of basically one. Yes. I mean, Titanium Noir. Yes, I want to do more Cal Sanders stories. And I want to take the universe wider. I want to see more of the place. I want to explore the critique a little bit more. Obviously, Titanium Noir is a short book. It's not like a gnome one, so you can't get deep into the social fabric. What you can do if you're writing more stories is build the social fabric, build the reality of the world, the issues you want to raise as a mosaic, so that it's never intrusive. It's only there if you want it. But it's storytelling, and it's and it's comment, and I think that's fun. As we learn more about the Titans, so we have to learn more about the problems that they make, because inevitably, I mean, I said it when I think earlier on, the thing is that in that world, which is not a million miles from ours in this way, money flows downhill. And downhill in this context is into a giant pit, which is the downward slant of the terrain is caused by the Titans, by their economic, social weight in the world. And everybody else is on dry land, and everything else flows. All the good things flow downhill towards them. And there are consequences to that. Inevitably, there must be. And then in kind of, if I want to go there are interesting things to discuss about how what happens as you keep taking T7. There are consequences to that too, because the cube law applies. The human circulatory system is not designed to deal with that. So there's a sell-by date on how many times you can take the drug.
No, definitely. Well, I certainly hope to read more stories in that world. What was the last book that you read?
What was the last book that I read? I am reading Naomi Alderman's new one, which doesn't come out until the autumn. I have just bought Danube, which is about the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Go figure. I loved Ring Shout. I'm trying to think what the last thing because in between Ring Shout and Naomi's book, I started something and I don't know what it was, which is terrible. there we go. That's that's the best I can do at the moment.
That's fine.
What about the last film that you watched?
Quantumania.
No.
Any good?
Which I enjoyed. I have to say, there's been a lot of grousing about it. I had fun.
Cool. And last TV show that you watched or are watching?
Oh, hang on. I watched something wonderful. I've lost track of it. Okay, so in various different layers, my wife and I are watching Citadel for a giggle, which is fun. My children are watching The Owl House, which is unbelievably awesome, and I've just watched the episode where Ida comes to terms with the owl beast, and it's one of the best things I've seen. It's just a beautiful piece of animation. It's really, really clever, really great storytelling. I'm slightly blown away. I tell you what, a lot of the writing for TV and for all those Marvel shows and for a lot of animated films and animated TV and sort of assorted franchises is much, much better than not than you would expect, because we're coming to expect that it should be very high quality, but it's just very, very good. And whether you think that's because the sort of the franchises are sucking in all the talent, or whether you just think that those are, I think that's obviously true, but I think those ideas, as I said, they build up intensity and depth over time, and if you mine them properly, you produce extraordinary narratives. Doesn't matter that they're franchises. I just think some of the stuff is very good. And again, I watched something in a not English language recently, and I cannot for the life remember what it was, and it was brilliant. I'm going to say Das Boot, although that was a bit longer ago. The U-boat drama was extraordinary. But there is something else, and again, I can't remember. I'm very flaky at the moment and terribly bad at remembering what's amazing, but I do keep a list somewhere.
Have you watched, just speaking about great animated shows, have you watched Arcane on Netflix?
I haven't. I just saw a thing saying how amazing it was, and I was like, oh, yes, I must do that.
Yeah.
It's very good. I think new season's coming out in a few months, but yeah, it's definitely worth catching.
Okay. No, I'm completely sold, actually. I saw that and I was like, oh, yeah, no, that looks like a thing for me.
The very, very last thing we'd use is a super quick fire either or, and I suppose I say there's no right answer apart from perhaps one of them, but we'll start off with William Gibson or Philip K. Dick.
What am I doing? Am I having lunch or am I reading?
Yeah, exactly.
Having lunch.
I mean, always Bill. He's just a genuinely nice man. I'd I mean, obviously, and Philip K. Dick is also dead, which makes him less
lunch would.
I mean, I would love. It's one of those things, isn't it? You think, oh, it'd be great to have lunch with Philip K. Dick, or oh, it'd be great to have lunch with Hunter Thompson. You're like, actually, it might not. It might be awful. Exactly. No, definitely Bill.
TV or cinema?
What's the difference?
Oh, well, that's a good question. I suppose the experience of watching a film in cinema or sitting at home on your couch.
I think they belong in their different spaces. I really do. And I think the overlap in talent now is so enormous that it's less of a question than it ever was.
Yeah.
If you make me choose at the moment, I'll take TV only because the long form is amazing and you can do this extraordinary stuff. But I love the cinema.
Night owl or early bird?
Oh my God, do I have to be one or the other? I'm neither. I sleep. I love sleep. So when I was younger, night owl every time. And I used to do the bulk of my writing late. Now I have kids. I wake up in the morning at sometime around 6. And I have a day to get through, so that it's just rationally, it's just much better. And I do, but I always made a promise to myself that I would write where and when it was useful to write, not on some mystical schedule. I don't like mystical sort of claims about writing because I feel like they shut people out. And screenwriters obviously have to be able to write on set, in hotel rooms, under the bar, wherever you're being asked to write. And so that was the discipline I set myself then, and I've kept it up now. So I wrote, I edited the last chapters of Angel Maker in the hospital while my daughter was being born. You write where you write and you write when you write. It doesn't matter.
Cool. And music or no music when you're writing?
Oh, good call. Both. But I mean, I will use music, which I'm aware some people find difficult. Generally, it has to be without lyrics or lyrics I know very well.
Mm-hmm.
I use it as a mood setter. I use it to kickstart when I don't feel like writing, but I know I've got to. Music is useful. And at the moment, we've just started sharing an office, me and my wife, and I'm going to have to get headphones because she absolutely will not have music while she's working.
And the last one, audiobook or ebook?
Ooh, controversial. I will say audiobook, and I will also say that I love ebooks and they have really great use cases. But I think we won't see ebooks reach their full potential until someone builds a beautiful ebook reader.
Okay.
Nice.
What would your ideal ebook reader look like?
Everybody wants the same beautiful ebook reader. You want a magic book that feels like a paper book, smells like a paper book, doesn't weigh anything, and when you get to the end, you close it, and then you open it again. It's a different book.
A different book. Yeah. Okay. I like
Yeah,
that.
and you want this. You want the magic physical book experience with every single book in existence. Ideally, it should probably look like that. And hang on, yeah, it's a gold spine. And it should magically transform into the next book you want to read.
Excellent.
But those are hard to build.
Yeah.
Oh man, I would love to see his version of a Star Wars movie.
I know.
It'd be incredible.
It sounds like he has a couple of great ideas there. So yeah, as he said, Dave Filoni, if you are listening, get Nick involved. And also, if you are listening, come on our podcast.
Yeah, if you're listening, I mean, how the hell do you find this?
Yeah, exactly. But no, seriously, thanks very much to Nick for taking the time to come on the podcast. He's an author that I've always enjoyed reading, and really interesting guy and great insight into the process of his writing there. Yep. So I would highly recommend picking up Titanium Noir if it sounded good to you, and if not, if you've not read Gnomon and you feel like a bit of a challenge.
I have Gnomon on my TBR shelf.
Well, yeah, it's definitely worth reading.
I need to read. I know it sounds fantastic.
But next week we've got another great guest.
Yeah, next week we're chatting with the awesome Cole Haddon, whose first book, I should say, is Psalms for the End of the World, which came out end of last year in hardback and has just come out paperback in May this year, is a really kind of crazy, lots of different small stories.
Yeah, it's another hugely ambitious book, actually, after speaking about Gnomon.
Yeah, I'm kind of halfway through it and really enjoying it. It's great. And he's also he developed the Dracula show for NBC, starring Jonathan. Is it Jonathan Rhys-Meyers?
Yeah.
Is that his name? Yeah. Which is he has a really great bunch of articles online about his disastrous time making it. So it's a really interesting behind the scenes look into network TV show. And it's a really fun chat we have with him. Yeah,
so whether you're into novel writing or screenwriting, he has information and great insight into both of those skills. So please do tune in for that one. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please do take the time to rate and review us on your favourite podcast app.
And of course, if you want to get in touch, you can always drop us a tweet in the Twitter machine, which is at UKPage1, or you can send us an email, which is podcast@writegear.co.uk, or you can go via Mastodon, which is writing.exchange/@page1pod, or of course we have our YouTube channel, which is
at Page One Podcast.
Damn, at Page
almost.
One Podcast.
You almost did
so
it.
Well.
I know. I thought, oh God, he's even going for the YouTube. He's going to do this. Yeah. No, nearly. I'm going to make you do this at the live show. I hope you know that.
Oh, I'm going to have to write it down word for
word. Cool. But otherwise, have a great week, and we will speak to you next episode.
See you later.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, please leave a comment down below, hit that thumbs up button, and be sure to hit that subscribe button as well so you never miss an episode like these ones below.
And if you want to get in touch, you can always drop us a tweet in the Twitter machine, which is at UKPage1, as evidenced here, and our other social media channels are available.
Otherwise, we hope to see you next episode.
See you later.